Before we get started, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Addie Chung. I'm the Associate Director for International Student Career Engagement at the USC Career Center. And with me, I have Bernard or Bernie Wolfsdorf. He is a managing partner at WR Immigration. Also, you may recognize the name. He's a founding partner as well. And he's been an incredible partner to the USC Career Center, providing information to our students and employers through workshops and participating in our events about immigration, various work visas, green card pathways for our international students. So I'm really excited to have him here to talk with all of you. There are just a few housekeeping pieces. So Bernie is going to do about a 45-minute presentation to start, and then we will open it up to Q&A at the end. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat during the presentation, but we will not get to them until the end. So just be aware of that. And without further ado, I'll pass it on to Bernie.
Thanks, Addie. Much appreciated. Look forward to outlining a plan of action for you folks today. As Addie said, I'm going to go through the basic visa options. And at the end, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I will answer them. If you can keep them as short as possible, that's helpful. And because we've got a relatively small group, I want to try something a little bit new. If you want to share your resume at the end, of course, you know, there's a confidentiality issue because we're recording this. But if you want to share your resume, I'd probably be able to go through it and give you a quick assessment on what sort of eligibility we have and what sort of options we have. So without further delay, again, the standard legal disclaimer, this recording does not constitute legal advice. If you need legal advice, there's my email address, visalaw@wolfsdorf.com. If you need to learn more about us, go to our website, wolfsdorf.com, my last name. The firm is a lot bigger than me, thank goodness. We're close to 200 staff. We have 10 offices, 2 offices in Los Angeles, and then we've got Bay Area, Boston, San Diego, blah, 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 New York. So we do have quite broad footprint. We also actually do global immigration, which is to more than 120 countries. So Eddie already introduced herself. She's been incredibly proactive in helping students develop their careers. And if you haven't scheduled an appointment, I strongly recommend that you reach out to her office. There's a little bit of information about our firm, but let me focus on the most important aspect. So you have 2 types of visas. You have temporary visas. That includes, of course, the H-1B, O-1 visa, which I'm going to spend some time talking about. And then you have the immigrant visa, and the other word, of course, for that is green cards. What is a green card? A green card is the right to live and work in the United States for your entire life and to apply to become an American citizen after 5 years, or if you got your green card through marriage to an American citizen, 3 years. In some cases, you may be allowed to have dual citizenship, but a lot of countries such as China, India don't really allow that. In terms of the temporary short-term work visas, I'm not going into OPT today, optional practical training, or CPT, curricular practical training. But I am going to emphasize that if you're going to apply for OPT, you need to make sure that you submit your application within 30 days of the DSO recommendation and within 60 days of completion of studies. Now, every year, every single year, I get a few calls from students who missed the deadline. And it's heartbreaking, particularly the STEM, because with STEM, you not only get your 12 months of employment authorization, but if you are working for an E-verified employer, you get a 24-month extension. There's a lot of advantages to being on OPT, including no Social Security withholding, no federal unemployment withholding. So at the end of the day, you're going to take home more of your salary, and that's also good for the employer in terms of matching. So back to temporary work visas. The non-immigrant work visa category, I am going to deal with the H-1B to start off with. If any of you are currently on H-1Bs, working for USC, for example, you have what we call a CAP exempt H-1B. If you go out into the general employment world, you need to participate in the H-1B lottery. Now, the H-1B lottery, and I'm going to go through the timing of this. H-1B is your basic work visa. It's approved for an initial period of up to 3 years, renewable for up to 6 years, unless you are in a backlogged category and you filed your green card at least before the 5th anniversary of H-1B. So if you've had 5 years of H-1B and you've not started a green card, you may have a problem. So bear in mind, H-1B can be extended beyond the 6 years, but only if you filed for a green card 12 months before your 6-year anniversary. So when you're at 4.5 years of H, stop, think green card. Actually, you can start thinking green card today. The general characteristics of H-1B is that it is employer specific. So if you have 2 part-time jobs, 20 hours a week each, you would need 2 H-1Bs, concurrent H-1Bs. That's possible. You can have an H-1B for part-time employment. One of the nice things about the H-1B is called portability. What that means is that if you're on an H-1 now with a cap subject employer and you get a new job offer, you can start immediately upon filing of the second H-1B. So the H-1B is your basic professional work visa. This is a postdoc workshop. In my opinion, each and every one of you is qualified for an H-1B based on your credentials, but there are other requirements. For example, salary. The salary must be a so-called prevailing wage. That can be an issue, and the employer has to pay the prevailing wage. Now, there are 65,000 H-1Bs allocated every year, plus 20 for U.S. master's degrees or higher. So U.S. PhD would qualify, but it has to be a U.S. graduate degree. And so there's 2 lotteries, one for the 65,000 and then another for the 20,000 if you qualify for the master's or higher degree H-1B lottery, you get 2 bites at the apple. This is for private employers. If you're going to be hired by a university or research entity, sometimes hospitals, you may well be cap exempt, which means you don't have to apply during the designated period. But please be aware of this, and I'm going to deal with this a little bit more. Here's the timeline. February 25. If you're going with an H-1B, that's the time to start the H-1B sponsorship. During the month of March, we have to register all foreign nationals. The employer does this. And then there's a lottery that is, there's a typo here. I thought they fixed it, but maybe I'm using the wrong version. So the lottery is conducted after March 2025. And if you are selected in the lottery, you have 90 days to file your H-1B. So this chart perhaps shows it better. Let's assume that you graduated in June of 24. You're on OPT, started July. You file your H-1B in April. Your OPT expires 12 months later. Let's assume it's not STEM. And you can then get something called cap gap closure or work authorization until your H-1 kicks in, because the H-1 only kicks in October 1. So for many of you, you may need cap gap closing. Contact the international office. They will help you with that. And so technically speaking, if you're STEM OPT, you could get 39 months of OPT, 12 months, 24-month extension, and 3 or 4 months of cap gap work authorization. So this is the important transition from F1 OPT to H-1B. What are the statistics? Last year was a little bit better. This is 2022 statistics were 25%, 31% for the masters. We still haven't got the final numbers for last year's lottery, but I would say for the masters and above was probably over 30, 35%, which is a pretty horrible statistic, right? More than half do not get selected. So don't assume you're going to win the H-1B lottery in your first application. If you're going to get 3 years of OPT, you probably want to apply at least twice, maybe 3 times. Get on the H-1B as soon as possible, because chances of being selected are, let's say, 30, 40%, assuming you qualify for the U.S. master's degree additional 20,000. So your basic transition again is from F1 OPT. I know some of you may be J1s. I'm going to talk a little bit about J1s. It probably needs an entire seminar of its own. I want to educate you on all the options. Now, this is the biggest headache. I mentioned to you that for H-1B, the employer has to pay a prevailing wage. I have included there the link to the prevailing wage website. If you're looking at an H1, I need you to play with this. Spend 10 or 15 minutes, go online. Now, if you're getting a really high salary, you probably don't need to worry about it. But a lot of people come to me and they say, well, it's my starting job. I'm ready to take a lower salary. Yeah, you may be, but the Department of Labor requires the payment of a prevailing wage. So this also depends on the location of the job. So you need to know which county you're going to be working in, and then go online and see what the prevailing wage for H-1B for a software engineer in San Francisco is, and you'll be pretty surprised how high it is. So not only do you have to have an employer and sponsor for the H-1B, but the employer has to agree to pay the prevailing wage. So do your research. There it is. There's the link. Hopefully that graphic will work. If you scan it, you can probably play with it while we're going through some of the slides. Now, I briefly spoke about CAP-exempt organizations, universities, and colleges. Nonprofit organizations affiliated with institutions of higher education. Nonprofit research, that's not all. It's not nonprofit organizations, it's nonprofit research organizations. So if you are switching from CAP exempt, such as university, to private industry, you need to participate in the lottery. Now, there is a bridging technique. So if you stayed on your CAP exempt H1 for 20 hours a week, you can then get a full-time H1B with a CAP subject, provided you have concurrent employment. That's a little bit complicated, but you're all smarter than me, so I think you can figure that out. You've got one job with USC, 20 hours a week, and you have one job with Microsoft, 40 hours a week. You do not have to be selected in the H-1B CAP in order for that to occur. Now, I get this all the time. H-1Bs for startups. Well, I already explained the big problem with regard to salaries. The company has to, so if you're going to be the CTO for a small startup, that entity has to pay the prevailing wage, and startups usually can't do that, particularly your own startup. So this becomes a problem. Secondly, there's supposed to be a legitimate employer-employee relationship. So if you own the majority of the shares of this company, it can be a problem getting an H1. One of the things that I've done in the past is we set up an independent board of directors that can hire or fire you and has full control over the company. That may meet the requirement for the employer-employee relationship. If you happen to come from Chile or Singapore, you don't need to worry about the H-1B CAP. They have a separate quota, free trade agreement. And if you come from Canada or Mexico, you may be eligible for the NAFTA TN, which is very similar to the H-1B, but easier, usually. Particularly since you don't have to do the labor condition attestation for the TN. There's a visa called the E3 for Australians, if there's any amongst you. That's the equivalent of an H-1B, does need a prevailing wage and an employer. Your spouse on an H-4 does not obtain work authorization unless you have an approved immigrant visa petition and you're in a backlog. J-2 spouses can get work authorization. And I'm not really going to talk about the L1 company transfer. I'm going to go straight over to the J1. Now, if you're on a J1 and your DS 2019 indicates that your country is on a list of your occupation and country list shows a shortage in that arena, you are then subject to a 2-year home residence requirement. You can also be subject to the 2-year home residence requirement through government funding. Now, there are 3 or 4 ways to get past the 2-year home residence requirement. The no objection statement from your home government is one way. That will not work with a Fulbright. So if I've got Fulbrights in the audience, no objection alone will not work. If you can get an IGA, interested government agency sponsor, that may work. It's incredibly difficult. There is a persecution waiver if it would be dangerous for you to return to your home country. It's very similar to applying for asylum. But the advantage, of course, is that you're in status. Asylees are not in status. And then if you can prove exceptional hardship to your U.S. citizen spouse, so being married to an American doesn't get you the waiver. You have to prove exceptional and unusual hardship. I had a case which actually was a Fulbright. I managed to get a hardship waiver. Person was from a country where it would be dangerous for Americans to live. And I was fortunate to be able to get a waiver. But sometimes the government will argue we'll just be separated for 2 years. We don't care. In this case, there was a good reason why they could not be separated. So J1s present a huge problem if you are not able to obtain a no objection waiver. 85 to 90% of the waivers are granted through the no objection category. If there's government funding, that can be more difficult to obtain. If there's Fulbright, no objection alone probably won't work. You probably need to get the Fulbright committee to agree, and they rarely do agree to a waiver. Let's talk about the O1 visa. I love the O1 visa. I haven't seen your resumes yet, but I'm going to speculate that most PhDs would qualify for an O1. O1 needs an employer. And again, you could probably use the O1 in a startup context. O1 is broader in terms of who can petition for you, employer, manager, or agent. But they do expect you to have prearranged employment. The O1 visa is approved for an initial period of 3 years. And here's the lovely part. It can be renewed indefinitely. O1 is a person of extraordinary ability in art, science, education, or sports, which is pretty much everything. But the standard is quite high. We need to demonstrate your accomplishments, awards. I'm not interested in that book award you got at high school. They have to be significant awards. Scholarships, fellowships, maybe. High salary is proof that you owe one. So that's high salary in relation to other similar people. Press articles about you. We love press. Very often, the first thing I'm going to say when I evaluate an O1 is send me articles about you. This reference letters, everybody's got reference letters. The reference letters need to focus on your accomplishments. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail. But O1 is possible for startups. And actually quite a few have been issued. Our office files so many of these O1s. Most of you are aware that you can obtain O1 approval in the United States, H1 approval in the United States, but you need to travel abroad in order to obtain a visa stamp in your passport. This can sometimes be challenging. And I'm not going to go into a whole lot of depth. I will say that the State Department is now granting waivers of interviews if you apply for the, so assuming you're applying for an H-1B renewal, you may not have to have an in-person interview, but you do have to be physically present in the consulate. So if you had an H-1B stamp within the past 4 years, you may be able to get a new H-1B stamp without having an interview. This comment about uptick in admin processing, particularly important if you are in a sensitive area, if you are from China or India, or pretty much any country, quite frankly, but more China and India, Russia certainly. You apply for a visa, you might be subject to admin processing. This can take weeks or months. If you are from Iran, for example, particularly a male, almost guaranteed. Third country national visa appointments. This is when you're not applying in your home country, but another country. That is now permissible, but it varies from country to country. So you really need to know what you're doing and where you're applying. There are many other types of non-immigrant visas. Mention a few here: F1 student visa, H1, H3 trainee visa, H4 spouse, company transfer, O1 visa, extraordinary ability, P visa, performing arts, groups, Q visa, cultural unique. The one visa I haven't mentioned today is the E visa. There are over 80 countries, excluding China and India, including Pakistan and Taiwan. They have E2 treaty. If you invest in a new startup business or any business, you might be able to obtain an E2 visa. In the case of Pakistan or Taiwan, that's a 5-year work visa. China and India do not have the E2. Now let's talk about the green card, because that's really where I want to spend most of the time today. You know, we've been dealing with a certain number of layoffs, quite frustrating when people are stuck in the middle of the green card waiting line. And if you want to have a secure future in the United States, you need a green card. The 4 basic ways to obtain a green card that I'm going to focus on without having an employer. There is a process, of course, with the employer sponsoring you. Several processes, but the most common, of course, is perm. They advertise the job, show that there's a shortage of workers. That's nice. But you may not need to have an employer sponsor you. So I want to talk a little bit. There's a little duplication here on the slide. I'll start off with the diversity lottery. Unfortunately, and I keep talking about China and India. China and India are not eligible. The lottery is held announced in October. Usually the draw is in November. That is the registration. You do not need a lottery. You do not need a lawyer for lottery. They will be issuing 51,500 green cards. That's a lot of green cards. They will be sending out 100,000 winning notices, and then they knock out half of them. So it's not an automatic win situation. I normally say you don't need a lawyer to apply for a lottery, but if you are selected, you may want to use a lawyer. We have very high success rate, and bearing in mind the statistics are only 50-50 after you've been selected. Let's talk when you win in April or May next year, if you're eligible. Family-based immigration. So family-based immigration comes in 4 sizes. Family-based first preference, second preference, third preference, and fourth preference. Fourth preference is the sibling category. Waiting line is about 17 to 20 years. So if you have a brother or sister who's an American citizen, you can file now, and maybe in 20 years' time, you'll get a green card. Not joking. And then the thing that I really want to spend most of the time with today is EB1A, employment-based first preference, EB2, NIW, the National Interest Waiver. And I'm going to start off with some really good news. I am going to predict that 80% of the people in this audience are eligible for an NIW. 80. 4 out of 5. That made you feel happy. Unfortunately, there's always a catch. What is the catch? Catch is this NIW EB2 has been so popular, we have a waiting line. How long is the waiting line? For other than China and India, it's bearable. For China and India, it's awful. And I'll get into that later. However, even if the EB2 is backlogged and you are from India, for example, or from China, it is highly advisable to file now. Because when you file, you get a priority date, a filing date. That stays with you forever. So let's assume you are not yet EB1A, but you are EB2 NIW. You file now, you get an approval, you get to keep your priority date. And it may be that in 3 or 4 years' time, when you win your Nobel Prize, not quite, but you have additional accomplishments, at that point, we can convert your EB2 to EB1, and you keep your place in the waiting line, because EB1 is also backlogged for India and China. Yes, EB1 is also backlogged for India and China. It's bearable for China. It's not good for India. Of course, this is a compliment saying how many smart Indians we have. There are 300,000 plus Indian students in the United States, but there's a big problem with waiting lines. I think you all know that, but some of you may not know how bad it is exactly. Please don't shoot the messenger, but I will get into that in a little bit more depth. So so the list of who's not eligible, Canada was out last year, as is Mexico, China, India, Philippines, all out. But if you are eligible, there's the website. Take your picture. Now, let's assume you are from China, but your spouse is born in Hong Kong or Macau. Wait, Macau they incorporated. Oh gosh. But Hong Kong they left separate. Yeah. The rules are quite stupid. So let's suppose you are born in China, but your spouse is born in Hong Kong. You can both apply for the lottery under the Hong Kong quota. Let's assume you're born in India, your spouse is born in Pakistan or Sri Lanka. You're both eligible to participate in the lottery. Let's assume your spouse is born in the Philippines and you are born in France. You can cross charge. So be aware of that. You can cross charge to your spouse's country of birth for the lottery. So even though you're not eligible, you can become eligible by virtue of marriage, of course, good faith marriage. The list changes every year. It's about to come up in the next month or two. Do it, do it, do it. I spoke about family immigration. Now, the first category is called immediate relative. That is when you marry an American citizen. If you marry an American citizen, you'll get a green card probably within a year. You'll get a full green card. That takes 3 or 4 years at least. It has to be a good faith marriage. Phony marriage doesn't work. It's quite hard to make a good marriage work, never mind a phony marriage. You will normally get your work permit and travel permit within 6 to 8 months. Marriage cases have actually been going very quickly, but I still put in your 12 to 18 months for processing, and you get a 2-year conditional green card. Once you become an American citizen, you can sponsor your parents for a green card, and that falls under the immediate relative category. I'm going to move to the visa bulletin. Visa bulletin comes out around the middle of every month. We're waiting anxiously for the October visa bulletin because that's the beginning of the immigration fiscal year. If you just search visa bulletin, you will see this a version of this document. This is the family-based visa numbers for September. If your spouse has a green card, you're subject to this F2A category, the second one, and the waiting line is about 3 years. So if you're about to get a green card, you want to marry, and you're going to marry your girlfriend from back home, you need to do that before your green card is approved. If you marry one day after your green card is approved, you got this 3-year waiting line. So this is very important. If you're planning to marry your girlfriend from back home or boyfriend from back home, do it before you get your green card or be stuck in this waiting line. F4 is the sibling category. They're currently processing 2007. That sounds like it's, what, 17-year wait? It's really longer. So don't call me if you want to file that one. I'm too old. I don't want to do a 20-year case. I'm not signing up 20-year cases. Plus, I don't know who wants to wait that long. Now, this is the very important chart, the visa bulletin. This is September. As I said, we're waiting for the visa bulletin to come out for October. I'm going to spend a little bit of time studying this. Under the first preference employment category, everything is current unless you come from China or India. China's not too bad. November 22 looks like about 2 years. It's really more like 3 to 4 years. India, February 22, looks like 2 or 3 years. It's really 4 or 5 years. I don't know what nationalities we have here yet, but my guess is it's more than half China and India. Lots of smart people in China and India. Terrible waiting lines as a result. Now we go to second preference, and I got all excited about NIW, EB2 NIW. Now, the NIW category is backlogged for everybody. But for China and India, it's not good. For the rest of you, and I said that 80% of you probably qualify for a self-sponsored NIW, and I got you all excited. But I didn't tell you that even if your petition is approved, you cannot do concurrent filing and get any benefit until your number comes up. At the moment, EB2 is backlogged till March 23. So you say, well, that's not too bad, a year and a half wait. We don't know if it's a year and a half wait. In the next week or two, the October Visa Bulletin will come out, and we're very anxious to see what the NIW second preference cutoff date is. This is called the final action date. Till your number comes up, you're not eligible for a green card. China EB2 is March 20. Don't shoot the messenger, me. I'm predicting that is 6 to 7 year wait. And this, with third preference for China, I'm saying that's 8+ years. If you're from China or India, you really don't want to wait. You've got to get started now. The waiting line for Chinese EB2, and I'll keep changing, probably about 6 years. And for EB3, it's probably about 8 years. Now, of course, Kamala Harris is running for president. If she gets elected, she's going to fix all our problems. If Donald Trump is elected, he says he's going to make it more difficult. It's already difficult. I don't know how much more difficult he can make it. But he did last time. I'm not going to get into politics. I can just tell you that it was difficult last time. India, second and third preference. I don't even want to talk about it. Just look at the numbers. I don't know how long that Indian second preference is. And I don't know how long that Indian third preference is. I could make bad jokes like I wish you long life. But it's very long. And that's why I'm saying that if you're from India, you may want to file an EB2 now just to capture a priority date. And then in a few years' time, as you get stronger, we upgrade it to EB1, which is bearable, not good, but bearable. So that's also backlogged. So you get your place in waiting line with NIW. You upgrade it to first preference. It's a little bit better. Now, a few of you might be wealthy or rich. A few of you might have wealthy or rich parents. So we're going to look at the EB5 category. The waiting line for China and India under the new rural set-aside, current. Waiting line under the high unemployment set-aside, current. Infrastructure, very small, current. So if you are wealthy, and by wealthy I mean 800,000 is the current minimum investment. I'm going to surprise you, but we have filed hundreds of EB5 this year because of this. Mainly Chinese and Indian. Pretty much all Chinese and Indian. Why have we filed hundreds of EB5s this year? Not dozens, hundreds. The reason, quite simply, is because of these terrible waiting lines. And there's a lot of wealth in India, a lot of wealth in China. It's terrible, but for that reason, we've been very, very busy with EB5. I'm going to continue and go back to EB1. I'm not spending a lot of time with EB1, other than to say that you can self-sponsor. There's a second category of EB1B. This is not self-sponsored. This is if you are outstanding professor or researcher. This could be for a private company. If you have 3 years of teaching or research experience, and you can count experience obtained during your PhD, but you have to have international recognition for outstanding achievements, quite a high standard for EB1B. EB1A is also a high standard, and there's the multinational manager, but you have to have been employed for 1 year and 3 years preceding your entry. So for practical purposes, we're looking at EB1A. Now, here are some of the criteria. I'm going to spend a little time on the criteria. I told you your book prize is no good. But if you have prizes, internationally recognized prizes for awards, put them in your resume. We're on a separate section called Prizes or Awards for Excellence. Membership in associations. I'm not really interested that you joined IEEE. This is associations that require outstanding achievements. So this is the National Academy of Science. This is where membership is only for people with outstanding achievements. And there's also a typo because this should be a separate point. Published material about the applicant. So not an article you wrote, but an article about you in major trade or professional qualifications. So if you see there's an article about Bernie Wolfstorff, there was a feature about me in the LA Times a couple years ago, full page, was kind of surprised. But that would be useful if I was applying for EB1. Participation is the work of, as a judge of the work of others. So if you're a PhD sitting on other PhD committees, but mainly what we're looking for here are reviews. So you need to review articles for your boss. You need journal reviews. You review their journals. They review your journals. Everybody reviews everybody, but that is one of the designated criteria. You have to hit 3 of these to win. You normally need 5. Original scientific contribution of major significance in the field. Wow. That's quite hard. You all have original scientific contributions because you all have original PhDs. But was it of major significance in the field? Explain how your PhD has changed the way my iPhone works. My iPhone never used to work. Crackle, crackle, crackle. And you came up with a new methodology that improves the reception on my iPhone. Major significance. I love it. Authorship of scholarly articles in the field. Well, you pretty much all have that. But they have to be published in professional or major trade publications. So the journal that you were published in is relevant. Performing in a lead or critical role. Eddie, I believe, is the Associate Director of the International Career Office. It is a critical role at USC. I want you all to have titles like Associate Director, Assistant Director, Research Fellow. Could be. But what is your lead or critical role in an organization or established with a distinguished reputation? Well, you're all at USC. Does USC have a distinguished reputation? Yes, it does. So the fact that you have a key position at USC is important. I don't want to mention other schools, but they may not have that distinguished reputation. Now, the other difficult one for you folks is commanding a high salary. Unfortunately, that generally only happens in private industry. But you might argue that there is other significant remuneration, such as stock options. When your company IPOs, you're going to become a billionaire. So, first preference, as I pointed out, is currently backlogged for India and China. For China, it's bearable. For India, it's unbearable, which is why I keep talking about do the NIW first. You can qualify with a one-time achievement. So if you've got a Nobel Prize or a Grammy, because you're a musician, maybe. But most people qualify based on meeting 3 of the 10 designated criteria. I like to try and hit 5 or 6 if I can, because there's a second step. Not only do you have to meet the 3 out of 10, but they will also do an overall subjective analysis known as the Kazarian test. Dr. Kazarian was my client, Caltech researcher, remains a very good friend, by the way, but he tended not to publish. I nagged him endlessly. He wouldn't publish. He teaches and he researches. His boss won the Nobel Prize. His boss said that he was critical to the research. I finally got it approved. It only took me 10 years. I filed the first petition in 2010, and I finally got the approval in 2020. It was just under 10 years. We battled. We battled in court. We battled everywhere. This is a Caltech PhD postdoc, but it's 0 publications other than his PhD. So I use the example in the bottom paragraph If you've reviewed one manuscript, you've authored one article, and you received one lesser known award, it's not going to do it. This test for EB1 is tough. I said that 80% of you are probably going to qualify for NIW. I'm hopeful that there's 2 or 3 of you that are EB1s. I'm hopeful. I realize that in 4 or 5 years, most of you will probably be EB1s. The problem is it takes time to achieve all of these things. And that's the biggest headache. EB1 is difficult. By the way, sometimes referred to as EB1A, EB11. It's all the same animal. Now, if you're going to take any pictures, take a picture of this one. EB2 National Interest Waiver. This is the one that I believe all of you have a good chance at. Your work has to be of substantial merit and national importance. Here's some list. AI, machine learning. Hey, that's the same thing. Medical research, entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship. Health and safety, national defense, economic benefit in a depressed area, cultural, educational. And the example I used, improving my phone reception. I just doing, because often when I read what you guys are doing, I don't understand it. So I don't want the full technical explanation of RX52 times 27, blah, 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 blah. Tell me what it is you do. I improve the reception on your phone. I discover I'm going to cure cancer. I don't know what it is, but don't give me the technical stuff. We don't understand what you do. You're too smart for us. Make it simple. But here's the most important part. You have to be well positioned to advance the national interest. You don't have to prove that you have advanced the national interest. You don't have to prove that you've improved the reception on my cell phone. You just have to show me that your research is likely to improve the reception on my cell phone. And I keep saying that because where I live here, the reception's terrible. And it's getting worse over the years. But you are going to fix it. I know that. So how do you do that? You show that you are well positioned to do so. What is well positioned to do so? Well, what if your boss writes a letter saying that you are well positioned? His research in the area of blah, blah is going to improve everybody's cell phone reception. Very important. So this thing about being well positioned to advance the national interest is very important. So your work has to be of substantial merit and you're well positioned to advance it. And you have the equivalent of a master's degree, technically even a bachelor's +5. You got an NIW, folks. You don't need an employer. Now, before you all go and download the form and file, let me tell you, you need to put a lot of documentation together. How much? 3 inches? 5 inches? 10 inches? I don't know how many inches. They're still using paper. And these things get heavy. My FedEx bill is insane because of this. Because we ship trees all around with all the EB1s and EB2s. I'm going to talk a little bit about perm. So you've got an employer, you don't want to bother. Your employer will file a perm for you. I'll tell you, a lot of employers don't want to do it anymore. They say, go and do an NIW. There's also the third preference category. Third preference is not too bad unless you're from China or India. If you're from China or India, you've got to aim for first preference. And if you're not qualified, at least have a shot at EB2 now. So this is how the process works. Some of you may have employers who will do a labor certification, but you don't need that if you do an NIW. You file your immigrant petition. As soon as the visa bulletin says that a visa is available, you can adjust your status in the US if you are in lawful status, and you get your green card. 1, 2, 3. If the employer doesn't file a perm, you just go from orange to red to green. Now, I spoke about the EB1. Hopefully, we've got some rich people here. And I know you're not the rich ones. So you got to call up mom or dad or uncle. Say, hey, uncle, I need 800,000. I'm going to do this EB5 thing. Is EB5 dangerous? Yes. Does everybody get their money back? No. Can you get your money back? Yes. You have to do due diligence. You have to be very, very careful. I claim to know the difference between a good project and a bad project. But sometimes you have good regional centers with bad projects, bad regional centers with good projects. We can get into that separately. We have a huge EB5 department, but I don't want to spend a lot of time. If you have that case, please reach out to us. We can guide you through the process. It's a little ridiculous that people like you have to consider this, but unfortunately, some people do. There's priority processing for rural reserved. And that's pretty much all that I want to talk about. There's no waiting line for China or India under the EB5 program.